Right, welcome to our historical lecture block. I hope everyone managed to grab a quick bite. There will be another break at around 3. This is going to be a lecture by the inimitable Caroline Wise, who you may know from Starfire Publishing, from the Fellowship of Isis and from the magical world of Florence Farr, and producing those plays. I last saw Caroline speaking in June, at yours and Sue's event.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which was lovely.
Thank you.
And we will also be at the Glastonbury Occult Conference next year, which has nothing to do with me. We are very lucky to have Caroline here today to talk about the magical world of Steffi Grant. One of the reasons when Mog suggested Caroline speaking on this, I was very excited, is because, as a friend of mine has put it, when you talk about Thelema, it's very often men. And when you get into, especially the Typhonian side, a lot of people will highlight Kenneth Grant without really understanding the role that Steffi Grant played in the development of that. And I don't want to speak too much about that, because it's firstly not my subject, and it's also Caroline's presentation. So we're very, very glad to have Caroline here, and we'll be followed by Stuart and Keith from the Blessed House Foundation. So without further ado, Caroline Wise, thank you.
Okay, is this working now? Yeah. It's really true what Steph said, and that was in my mind when I was preparing this talk, is that there is an idea, and that idea is carried on quite shamefully by a lot of occultists today, that the wives in magical partnerships were just sort of there to make the tea and to look nice and so on. And actually, when you look into the really dynamic magical partnerships and Wiccan partnerships since the 70s, I don't know much about them before that, the women are absolutely dynamic and completely equal with the men. They work as teams. And you see that today with leading occultist and Wiccan teams. Steffi Friedman. By the way, Kevin said he was ADHD. I'm dyspraxic, so I will be probably doing the slides wrong. Oh, there we are. So Steffi Grant Lee Friedman was born in December the 1st in Berlin in 1923, and she died in London in October 2019, aged 95. I'll just briefly show. There she is, I think with her grandfather there, before the war, obviously. She married Kenneth Grant on St Valentine's Day in 1946, and they were married for life till Kenneth died in 2011, so that's 65 years. They were totally devoted to each other. Steffi had an iron discipline that their work that they had done in the 50s to the 90s must be published, and she became the driving force for this. Steffi was a powerhouse, and her art and design were equally important parts of her husband's writing, with the Typhonian trilogies, which are extraordinary works of magic and the doorways to magical universes, the kind of magical universes that Calvin was talking about earlier. Neither of them wanted to be public occult personalities. They're extremely private individuals. And the Grants became this great occult team. She completed the work. It was like a perfect symbiosis and a joint vision in manifesting the work. Now, Kenneth met Crowley in December 1944 at the Bell Inn in Ashton Clinton. You can still go there and be in the room where they met. And soon after, Crowley asked him to stay with him in Hastings, doing secretarial work in return for magical tuition. So Crowley was 69 and young Kenneth was 21. Steffi describes the period Kenneth was at Netherwood as stressful. They missed each other terribly. They weren't yet married. And Crowley had become increasingly demanding. And the owner of Netherwood wanted it to become an intellectual salon kind of place. Had people that Crowley described as weekend types coming down, you know, the intellectuals, the actors, the spiritualist mediums. And Grant himself found these people very loud and shrill. One of the few he liked was Dion Fortune, who paid private visit to Crowley. Probably to Grant, she was the only one saying anything interesting. So young Kenneth, serious and precocious, wanted to get on with the magic and mysticism and deep study from the Magus. And although Steffi would never hear a word against Crowley for the rest of her life, and had a very high opinion of Crowley's work, which she'd studied in depth, but I'm now, even now, only just coming to understand, having her papers to look at. She was studying the books that they were able to get and that Kenneth was able to send her. But she was also getting to understand Crowley and the Book of the Law, and even the Gnostic Mass, the words, they didn't do the ritual then, from the beast's mouth itself. And she was very loyal to the memory of Crowley and a Thelemite all her adult life, and she was referred to him as Old Crow. Steffi met Kenneth at her art school in Regent Street in central London when she was 19. She was stunningly beautiful, and Kenneth was pretty stunningly beautiful too. So this day it was her turn to clear up the props after the class, and that day it had been a still life class, and the object to be painted was a pint of beer. She was going to chuck it down the sink, just as this young man with saturnine good looks swept into the room looking for his own class. He was 17 years old. Steffi offered him the beer rather than waste it. And at that time, the legal age that somebody could be offered alcohol in Britain was 21. So she found it amusing all her life that their first conversation came about as she unknowingly offered alcohol to a minor. And their courtship became picnics in the parks, Regent's Park, Hampstead Heath. And they walked on Hampstead Heath's extension every day until Kenneth was literally towards the end of his life, the few months towards the end of his life when he was unable to. And you'd often see them up there because we used to walk our dog up there. And although we were friends with them, when we saw them on the heath, we would wave, but we'd never go over and interrupt because that was their very special thing. And there was jazz. He played her his records from his fabulous African-American jazz collection that he was building. And there was poetry, and there was art, and there was pubs. So, we don't need them yet. So how did she come to be in London in the first place? Steffi arrived as a refugee from the Nazis in 1938. Her father was Czech and her mother German, and she had a Czech passport. They were a secular Jewish family living in Germany. Her grandparents on her mother's side lived by Lake Lugano in Switzerland, and they were relatively rich, what we might call middle class in continental Europe at that time. And her memories, many were of parties her family had. There was always entertaining, and she would be presented to the company as the pretty girl in a nice dress, as if on display, which she didn't like, and lots of sumptuous cakes being served, which she did like. And life was good until the horror of the Nazis. So with extended family members already out of Germany and Europe, they had gone to northwest London, Swiss Cottage, St John's Wood, West Hampstead areas in the 30s. And Steffi's immediate family were allowed to enter Britain, and they settled in those North London areas too. And one of the reasons they got out safely was that her father had contacts around the world as he worked as a businessman in the timber industry. And it was the people outside of Europe who were saying to him, you've got to get out, that something bad is coming. And it was almost as if they could see it more from the outside than you think it's never going to happen, don't you, when you're actually on the inside. And so it was towards the end of 1938 that the decree forcing all Jews to transfer their businesses to Aryan hands was enforced, and her father had been astute enough to send his wife to live in France and Steffi to a school in Switzerland in the latter half of the 30s. So he was able to organise their eventual escape and have their family paperwork ready. And most of the relatives got out of Nazi Germany. Two apparently were stopped at the border with Netherlands and tragically not heard of again. I think they were uncles and cousins. Still, her father thought that he had time himself, but when he came home from work one day, he saw the neighbours downstairs outside the apartment building, and they said, don't go upstairs, they're waiting for you, presumably the Gestapo. And all he had was his briefcase from work, and he turned around, walked to the railway station, and was in terror all the way, but he managed to get out of Germany without being stopped. In a letter to Netherwood in March 1945, the envelope there I think is for the equinox, for I think it's tomorrow's date, the 22nd. Steffi wrote that Hitler must have been mad from the start, and how cruelly they applied their force to old people. I know, she said, I saw it with my own eyes. She mentions the horror of the jackboot and visions of people coming at her, flaming her with blue flame. And she said, I was only 10 or 12 then, so already it's entering the nightmares, it's entering the flashbacks, the trauma. And she goes on to say in the letter, she denies right-wing federalism as much as she does communism. And I think it's very hard for us today. We can empathise, but I don't think we can truly understand what the horror was like for being a Jew in Europe, and especially Germany at that time. She had no inclination to ever go back to continental Europe. And when my husband and I mentioned we were going to Berlin, she seemed surprised and said, why on earth would you want to go there? But I mean, if you remember Berlin at that time, why would you want to go back there? But she would look at old black and white photographs of Paris in particular, of the Café Society of Montparnasse in the past, and she would just be there, like in a reverie, and that was the good Europe that she'd left. So the years of bombing and rationing in England were as dismal for Steffi as they were for everyone, but she had a generally positive attitude because of what she'd escaped from. And her best friend Eva, who I met a couple of times and was at her funeral, she'd been Steffi's best friend since she was 5 years old, and they had also got out and settled nearby to Steffi's family. And they remained friends for life, and she tended to have friends for life. She had she didn't have loads of acquaintances, but the people who were her friends, she was loyal to for life. So in the 40s, Steffi told me that she and her friend Barbara Kindred would walk down Regent Street to art classes or the Café Royal arm in arm, wearing purple and red trouser suits, velvet of course, with trouser suits and bold necklaces and pendants, kind of like Bieber before Bieber, really. And Steffi didn't do false modesty. She was aware of her beauty as a fact, not something to use or something that she thought made her important than others or superior. But she knew that she and Barbara looked beautiful and stunning and ahead of their time. She petite and Barbara very tall. And people stared, she said. She had a kind of prescience of the swinging 60s to come. And both the Grants were in the slipstream of 60s psychedelia, although I'm not sure Kenneth actually would see himself as such. So she fully embraced Bohemian society in London and the post-war years with the artists, poets, novelists and the bright young things, and also the drunk young things. And she told me that Dylan Thomas had tried to pick her up once in a pub. And then she paused and said tartly, but he was drunk. She was fully integrated in this vibrant London scene, throwing off the greyness of the war. And she frequented the pubs of Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia, as did Kenneth, and hence Dylan Thomas, and of Hampstead. And the Week Sheaf in Rathbone Place was a particular haunt of the Grants and their friends. The interesting people, the art people, the journalists, the fashion people, and the witches, those were their interesting friends. Now, obviously those pubs are all in London, but I think some of you here will be very aware of them and know them. And in the Week Sheaf particularly, we have the Bohemian Society, which is like really a continuation of those days. And it was also once used for weekly occult meetings in the 90s. So the tradition continues. So Steffi was not a personality within the scene, though, and that wasn't her nature. And she didn't raconteur or be loud or play to the gallery or collapse drunk over the gallery, and nor did Kenneth. But it was this exciting world she was happy to be cocooned in, being in the moment, and also to keenly observe it. And she remembered the artist and writer Nina Hamlet, self-portrait there on the left, Queen of Bohemia and Queen of the Fitzroy Tavern, who was near the end of her life. And of course Steffi and Nina were linked via Aleister Crowley. Nina was, Steffi said to her, the old lady sitting at the table, and Steffi found her extremely interesting. Nina had been a colleague of Olivia Shakespeare and Ezra Pound. She'd been Modigliani's lover. She'd been a friend of many of the greats of creative imagination and modernism. She was a friend of Picasso and Jean Cocteau. And Steffi was like the next generation of the scene, although she wouldn't have known it then. A continuation of roots that go back to the Victorians in this web of connections and fascinating people who changed worldviews in many ways and certainly changed art and literature and poetry. And it was like the Grants were carrying this baton forward of this Zeitgeist energy as it evolved. And you know, what are those diagrams called, where you have a circle with something in it and then all these lines going off and all the connections? I can't remember what they're called. It's like that, almost going, the roots almost going to the Victorian times and the progressive thinkers then. And there's Dylan Thomas, in case you didn't know. Kenneth Grant had bought Austin Spare Book of Pleasure in the Atlantis bookshop in 1941, and although he fell in love with it, fell in love with his work, he saw multi-dimensions to it. But by the late 40s, the Grants believed that this amazing artist must be dead. And they discovered via a friend who'd read an article in a magazine on Spare that he was still alive. And Steffi wrote to Spare via the magazine. It was really difficult for us today, I think, to remember a world without Google. Just hit up the artist, see where he is. And he invited her to come and see his pictures, and then sniggering at the back. I went armed with some money, she said, and she bought two for Kenneth's birthday, one of which was the famous Black Eagle portrait that he saw very much as his outer spirit guide, in the same way that he saw the Delphic oracle as his female inner guide. So Spare painted them, or did pastels of them, both together and separate several times. So that's Steffi there. So this painting, Steffi and Kenneth painting here that you'll see on the left, is rather beautiful, appeared in his 1949 Temple Bar exhibition. So that's not very long after we met them. Oh, those are the photos that she loved. These were the images that she loved. But staying with Spare, they became very close friends of Spare, who was now pretty much neglected by much of the art world, and they really did put him back on the art map. And they became close friends and supporters of him and spent many a night in London pubs again. And Steffi fondly remembered his jacket reeked of tobacco and beer, which seemed to hold it together, and which she said was a very strange smell. But she loved him. And the pubs they visited were often the spit and sawdust types, not the posh, the Bedwardian West End ones I mentioned earlier. And Steffi told me that she had a huge row with Austin Spare in a pub when he was running down Crowley, because she wouldn't hear a word against Crowley. And Spare had fallen out of fashion after the war, and the Grants felt he shouldn't be neglected by the galleries and the art world generally, which is of course very fickle. And the interest they revived is responsible for the burgeoning interest and the rising prices of Austin Spare's work today. The Grants always promoted people that they thought should be acknowledged, although they were very much an insular couple as well. And that writing to that magazine, I think she changed the course of all their lives. After Crowley's death, John Symonds and had Crowley's papers. And by the way, Symonds is the way the Grants pronounced it, and they knew them all their adult life. I know a lot of people say Symonds, but they say Symonds. There was masses and masses of material, And Kenneth typed Crowley's correspondence documents and diaries, just this incredible amount of typing to do on a manual typewriter, like weeks of non-stop. And then Gerald York got in touch, suggesting a methodical way they could do it, and which things were the most important and had to be done first. And the reason for this urgency was that the originals had to be sent to the USA, where unfortunately they were sent, and then they all ended up apparently being burned in a house fire. So thank goodness for the work that Kenneth Grant did that makes up the core of the York collection at the Warburg Institute, and Steffi was part of that too. So that's why we have access to this material, because if there were no copies, everything would be missing. No, maybe it was meant to be, I don't know. And Steffi would also translate the German occultist Eugene Groscher's correspondence with her husband both ways. She would translate both their letters into each language, which also contributed to our esoteric history. And like her husband, Steffi used handwriting and then later a manual typewriter. They never had computers. The online world was not in their consciousness at all, although they could take you into amazing dimensions. And they never saw an email in their life, and they never had a TV or even a tape recorder, although the radio was allowed a bit, and the record player for the jazz sufficed for them. And when visiting us, Steffi would sometimes stare at the large iMac and say, "Is that your television?" Because it was just another world. And as I mentioned, the Grants had interesting friends. The influential artists and designers Robert Colquhoun, no relation, and Robert McBride came to the Grants' home, and the two Roberts, as they were known. Steffi was an art teacher, and in the long school holidays, they spent most of the summer with members of Kenneth's family in Wales in the 60s and 70s. And Max Erse and Ben Nicholson visited them the times they were in Wales. Over quite a long period, they would visit Wales. And Steffi worked as an art teacher until retirement, mainly in a convent school in North London, complete with nuns. And I have no idea how she would have got on the nuns, probably got on with them swimmingly. And I wish I'd asked her. But a relative told me that some of the girls that she taught sent Christmas cards for years after they left, telling her of their lives, their babies, their careers and so on, which she really, really liked. She liked the fact that she had some effect on their lives with her teaching, because she wanted to go to the Royal College of Art, but there was no way that they could afford it. She could afford it, so she wanted to learn. She said, "I don't like their art, but I really admire their technical teaching," and she wanted to learn the proper techniques. But I think, as we'll see later, and I'll show you some of her work in a minute, she was pretty technically adept. And her interest for architecture, especially Georgian, whereas Kenneth liked the Gothic, and she said she would have liked to have been an architect and to have done architectural drawing. And she visited Kenwood House in Hampstead regularly, and every day, as I said, after her husband died, sitting in a cafe, and she never got tired of pointing out the architectural features, things that you might not normally notice. And she designed her own wedding ring, which was big and bold and modern in silver. And she liked black and white film photography, which she, of course, would only see once each time at the cinema. It wasn't their world where you would go back and see a film over and over again. You wouldn't be able to anyway, because it would not always, the program would be changed. But she could keep those images in her head for life. Anna walking past Martin's in The Third Man was especially evocative to her. She loved the imagery of the film, and she felt it was more riveting than the plot, which I suspect many of us feel that way. And she adored the theme tune, which was played at her funeral. And she had a great liking for the Soviet cinema photographer, Andrei Tarkovsky, and the metaphysical dreamlike visual imagery and his long takes. And she loved the image of Marlene Dietrich. And she also loved the imagery of spaghetti westerns, if not the stories. That's the self-portrait she Kenneth asked her to send a picture. I don't know whether he meant a photo. He couldn't just snap photos that easily. When he was at Netherwood, he wanted a picture of her. So she painted this self-portrait for him, which he was just absolutely staggered by. And she called it Gypsy. So perhaps she's seen herself in a Czech gypsy past or something like that. Or that's what she wanted to project there. Quite a dynamic picture. So he put it on the wall where he could see it all the time. This is Steffi's illustrated book of the law. She did this in 1944, so this is before Kenneth has moved down to Netherwood with Crowley. And she continued her exploration with the correspondence that she got from Kenneth from Netherwood. And he did say to her in a letter that he should be able to find quite a lot in the way of material to fill your notebook dedicated to the elucidation of Owl. Now, some of Steffi's notebooks have been published by Fulger. The depth of understanding of the occult with these letters between the two and then the subsequent ways she put it in her notebooks is absolutely staggering, especially for such young people. And so there was the correspondence at this time is deep discussions penetrating Liber Owl and other mystical and magical themes, including the words of the Gnostic Mass and the Book of Thoth. And this is really profound magical stuff for a 21 and 23-year-old. And there's masses of it. And also, the postal service in the war was better than it is now 80 years later. So if you wrote a letter one day, it would get there the next, and then they would reply, and so on. In this non-magical bit of the discussion, Kenneth tells Steffi, went to Hastings with 666 to get a few items. 666 is about as good at shopping as I am. And so in the great... They expected to walk into Hastings and buy papers and pens and all sorts of art material and writing material, and of course there's a war on, and so the shops didn't have any. So in the great British occult tradition, they went down the pub and they had a drink, and Kenneth said it cheered them up, and they went home fit for work. He asked Steffi for a picture of her. Oh yes, I showed you that one, the gypsy picture. So her illustrated book of the law we will publish. There's just two of us trying to get all this work out, but it's absolutely stunning. And Frida Harris came to look at it. And that is her illustration for Crowley's long horrid poem Thirst. And then Steffi and Kenneth produced the Carfax monographs, 10 essays issued between 1959 and 1963 with the intention to elucidate the hidden law of the West according to the canons preserved in various esoteric orders and movements in recent times. What's staggering about the Carfax monographs, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the originals, they're jewel-like, what's it called? Not A4, the old word, the long paper, foolscap, card with the essay in. So there was obviously a series of 10, and each one had a tipped-in plate. These were a couple of the plates that Steffi did. She did all of them. She did all of them except one, which was Austin Spare did, and that was a print. Now, what is even more staggering is that each tipped-in plate she painted separately. So she had to do 900 pictures for this limitation of the Carfax monographs. And these were sold in Watkins Books, and they went pretty much immediately, as far as I understand. This hugely original 50-year contribution to Thelemic literature and art is what Robert Ansel calls it. So Watkins Books sent it out to subscribers and to individual selected customers because there weren't many of them. And it's absolutely remarkable. And I initiated the republication of this in 1989, when I was at School of Books, for a series of extreme synchronicities. That's how I came to do it. And then Robert Ansell and Fulger republished Hidden Law with some of her Golden Dawn notebooks. And the Golden Dawn notebooks, I can't even describe the work and the understanding. I mean, you know, it's not just copying. She understood the deep mysticism within it all. So that book should be available from Fulger. And it's absolutely brilliant. And then the rest of it is the Hidden Law. So here we've got the Typhonian trilogies that I initiated the reprinting of again when I was at School of Books, 1990, and it was because we'd done Hidden Law, which came to us as a series of synchronicities. I wrote to Kenneth Grant and suggested that we republish The Magical Revival, The Cults of the Shadow, and Scrolling Hidden God. And that was when he realised very much that Steffi was much part of the team and the correspondent as Kenneth. And the art on the cover of the books and also a lot of the plates inside are by Steffi, absolutely brilliant, and absolutely a complete part of the book. They're not there to complement it, they're part of the magic. And Service of the Star and the Snake, if you want to learn about Kenneth Grant, because there's so much nonsense said out there about him and just baseless stuff, but if you want to learn, this is edited by Professor Henrik Bogdan, Service of the Star and the Snake, and there's lots of essays by various well-known occultists and writers and scholars on the work of the Grants and their importance. Just quickly have a look at some of her art. The Amber Woman, painted between trips to an air raid shelter. Bloody good, isn't it, she said modestly to my husband. And this appears as the frontispiece of Cults of the Shadow. It's absolutely fantastic. That's a picture you can go and get lost in. Black and white, pen and inks. The Dance of Kali. That's quite amazing. Steffi loved gardens, and she loved nature, and she loved the heaps. Hers had a lot of greenery, tall, bushy, bright pelargoniums at scarlet red, pink camellias, tall ornamental grasses, and had a bold and primal look, very much like an artist's garden. It was tended very much. She tended to her garden, but it wasn't manicured. And I could kind of imagine tigers stalking through there, through the tall plants. And under a yew tree, a statue of an angel they saw and fell in love with on their Welsh holidays in the 60s. Stands, very much a guardian figure to Kenneth, and a full life-size goddess outside the kitchen door with a small Cthulhu statue that I'd given them years ago and forgotten about, sits at the feet. I don't know if you can quite see it. And Steffi was fond of animals, cats and deer, toads especially, and she was fascinated by our small dog. There she is, 2 years before she died, with Professor Henrik Bogdan and my cat Stan, late cat Stan. And it was very rare for her to be in such deep conversation, but here she's got people she can talk to about history and magic. So that's quite a special picture. She's stepping out of the mundane world. one Christmas, in the year before she died, Robert Ansell, myself and my husband took Steffi out to lunch at the Spaniards Inn in Hampstead Heath. This had been an old haunt of the New Isis Lodge, which there isn't time to go into today, but that was a working lodge that Kenneth Grant led. And so there were members of the New Isis crew and fellow travellers that included actors and writers. They used to go there. And she was looking out of the window as we were having our meal and reminiscing, and she seemed to be in a reverie. And she was telling us that there had once been a lawn, which is now a car park, where she and Kenneth and members of the lodge sat and had drinks and picnics and talked. And she was remembering those that had now died, and some of them who perhaps had died young and so on. And it was as if she could see it all in front of her, and she was in that world again as she sat in the Spaniards Inn. Now, she never spent a single night away from Kenneth in almost the 65 years of their marriage, except when she had to go into hospital. When he had to go into hospital for a while towards the end of his life. So it's a fitting to end with a photo of them that was taken by a stranger on one of their walks on Hampstead Heath. And then when he saw them the next time, it was such a lovely photo, he approached them and asked if he could mail them a copy, and so he did. So there they are towards the end of their life on their beloved Hampstead Heath. Thank you.